Hi, everyone. Welcome to the March 24th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at last weekend's stake racing, which was topped by a pretty stacked card at Fairgrounds on Saturday. The big race there was the Louisiana Derby, what was previously a Kentucky Derby prep. I think we still would call it that, even though the Kentucky Derby is far off at this point. We'll discuss that race along with all of the other stakes racing that took place that day. Races like the Fairgrounds Oaks for the 3-year-old fillies and some races for the older horses, both on the dirt and the turf. We'll move on to Oaklawn Park, Santa Anita, and Gulfstream and discuss the stakes racing there and some notable performances in some maiden and allowance races. Craig, it's been a pretty interesting week with a lot of news coming out in racing, just generally in the world about everything that's happening. We are seeing a few more track closures recently. I know Fairgrounds announced they were going to cut their meet a little bit short after that Saturday card, the Louisiana Derby day. That was their final race day of the meet. Aqueduct obviously has been closed now for the past week. So a lot of other tracks are staying open for the time being. I think we'll see how long all of that holds.
Yeah, it's really hard to say for selfish reasons. I hope as many stay open as possible as long as everybody can remain safe out there. We'll just have to see how it goes. I suspect at some point sooner rather than later, we're probably not going to have much racing at all. But as long as it goes, at least it's a nice diversion from what else is going on in the world. And, I'm happy to have it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, it does make me a little nervous that a lot of these tracks are continuing to stay open because I just know the situation in New York. They were very, very proactive when somebody tested positive on the backstretch that they just shut everything down immediately. Obviously, the situation in New York City is a little different than it is from some other places in the country. Still, though, you do worry because if you've read about this disease and the way it spreads, it happens in clusters and it can quickly spread to almost everybody in a tiny community. And if there's an outbreak at one of these tracks that isn't contained, you really do have to worry because somebody has to take care of the horses. A lot of these jobs at racetracks, there's not, I'm sure as you know, there's not a clear backup for a lot of these positions. If somebody gets sick or if even worse, a whole group of people get sick or God forbid, even worse than that. So I do worry a little bit. And I hope that the people in charge of making these decisions are proceeding with an abundance of caution because you see a lot of chatter recently about people getting nervous about the economy. And I think we have to remember that people's lives and their health are really of the greatest importance at this time.
Yeah, I totally echo those sentiments. For example, like you say, in a little bit of a different vein, my wife works for the main utility company here in Oklahoma City. And just imagine if everybody goes back to work like normal and then a whole bunch of people get sick. You have things like your electricity could be in danger, your water for people that work at sewage plants. So obviously horses, as you say, somebody has to care for them. So it's scary times. And I really hope we're doing the best we can to avoid any spread.
Yeah, and I know people talk a lot about flattening the curve, and I know that's been a hashtag that's been thrown around a lot lately, and people are sort of getting tired of hearing that now because it does take a long time for a plan like that to really for it to become apparent that it's having the desired effect. It takes weeks, months, and we've only been in this for about 2 weeks at the most, with people actually realizing that it is this bad, and it seems like a lot longer than a couple of weeks, but that's really all it's been. And you just don't want to see people making hasty decisions because you're starting to see some undesirable effects regarding the economy when you have to remember that if people just do suddenly go back to work, I think the economic damage that's done by people getting sick in a whole host of industries and overloading the healthcare system is going to be so much worse than the temporary damage that we're doing to ourselves right now by taking these social distancing measures. That's just my 2 cents about the situation, though. But hopefully people are a little more patient and cautious and listen to some of the healthcare professionals who are recommending these strict measures that we're taking right now.
We're on the same page. Yeah. So let's get this horse racing.
Yeah, I know you feel the same way. I don't want to get too political or preachy about this. Okay, let's move on to the fairgrounds racing, and we'll start with that Louisiana Derby, which they ran at 1 3/16 miles this year, a new distance for that race, a 16th of a mile longer than in some previous years. And it was a race that we talked about in the TimeformUS forecast last week, projected to have a little bit of speed. It didn't necessarily develop in the way that a lot of people thought it might, because the race really was dominated by the front runners, and Wells Bayou, who was coming off that strong performance in the Southwest, the top speed figure in the race. I guess it shouldn't be a big surprise that the fastest horse in the race won the Louisiana Derby, did it gate to wire fashion, but nobody really had a chance to close in behind him.
No, it was this race actually played out pretty much exactly as the pace projector predicted, with Wells Bayou and NY traffic, or New York traffic. I didn't pay attention enough to know how they're pronouncing it, but they just went out. They led the race easily, and nobody made a run. And to be honest, I wasn't really surprised, because we talked about it on the forecast. I just did not think a whole lot of any of these Louisiana horses. It's one thing if you get a quick pace and it sets up for closers but it's a whole nother thing if the closers just aren't very good. And that's what I think we saw here. I had mentioned that I didn't think I'd have pace figures, but with more time on my hands than usual, for obvious reasons, I decided to go back and kind of look at all the different tracks that run them at a mile and a 3/16 and kind of come up with an expected baseline for the fairgrounds. And this one came out about as I expected. The pace was actually pretty quick. A lot of people were saying that Wells Bayou just waltzed on the 48 lead. And while he was clear, a 48 going a mile and a 3/16, especially over a track that wasn't particularly fast, is actually moving these days. So I have no problem rating them in red. Wells Bayou got a 115. It was boosted 5 points because of the pace in here. New York traffic got a 113, just 2 points below. And then everyone else was below the 110 mark. So it really was a two-horse race from start to finish. Once again, when we compare it to some of the other 3-year-old big races we've seen, it's not a particularly strong race. And I just think that the best horse won, but I don't think he's near the top of the division.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of that. I was one of the people, I would say, who was a little surprised to see the pace figures color-coded red here. I actually thought that this was a race that really, from a race flow standpoint, really favored horses towards the front end, and I thought those coming from the back were compromised a little bit. Just from a raw time standpoint, Wells Bayou actually did come home in respectable final fractions here. I mean, he ran the last 3/16 in 18 and 4/5 seconds, which is pretty, it's pretty solid. It's not crawling home. And I think that's why we saw no horses able to close from the back of the pack. I feel like, in a lot of these longer distance races, I know we've talked about this with a lot of the marathon races that run in New York. Sometimes we see a preponderance of slow paces in these races. So when we see a merely moderate pace, it ends up getting the red color coding, just because given the way riders ride these longer races these days, the moderate paces tend to be the outliers. I still think this was a race that featured a pace that favored horses towards the front end, despite that red color coding. And I think that did help Wells Bayou and New York Traffic, who I didn't see as a horse that wanted to go this far. A lot of people were saying that maybe the second division of that Risen Star ended up being stronger than the first division, because the three horses who, I guess, swept the trifecta that day in the second division finished 2, 3, 4 here in a different order. I don't know. I wouldn't be so keen on that opinion of revisiting the Risen Star, because I think trips played a big role in this race. And the winner of the first division of the Risen Star obviously wasn't in this field, Mr. Monomoy. I do want to highlight the performance of Major Fed, who was fourth, because he did have real trouble coming out of the starting gate, breaking from post one. He just was a little sluggish for that first couple of strides out of the gate, wound up in last place. He did make a long, sustained run from last to get up for fourth here in a race where nobody else really made up that kind of ground. So I did think he ran particularly well within the context of the race, but like you, this was not the most impressive of the preps we've seen, and I think there are better 3-year-olds out there. In the race right before the Louisiana Derby, we saw the 3-year-old fillies in action in the Grade 2 Fairgrounds Oaks. Again, this was supposed to be a Kentucky Oaks prep, but with the Kentucky Oaks so far away, I'll probably sound like a broken record saying this over and over again with these Derby preps as we continue to run them. But we'll see if these fillies actually do make it to the Kentucky Oaks. There was a big surprise in this race, because Finite, who had been on a 5-race winning streak, had made a believer out of basically all of her doubters coming into this race, and that's why she was bet down to be the 1-5 favorite. She just laid over this field, especially based on her most recent performance in the Rachel Alexandra. For whatever reason, though, she took a step in the wrong direction, and another couple of fillies fillies took a step in the right direction. And the one who really did was the winner, Bonnie South, for Brad Cox and Juddmonte. She was coming off a maiden victory at Oaklawn Park, and she stepped right up into stakes company and got the job done here, closing from all the way at the back of the pack. This was a race, despite the fact that the pace figures are in color-coded red, where closers really did seem to dominate.
They did. Bonnie South, she was kind of enhancing her win last time out in what's proven to be a strong allowance race from Oaklawn. She Dares the Devil, who was second that day, came back to win a graded stakes at the fairgrounds. The Honeybee, she got a 106 Timeform US speed figure for this effort, so it was a lifetime best for her. But again, much like the Derby, it's not exactly something that's going to strike fear in the hearts of the connections of other 3-year-old fillies out there. We should mention Brad Cox swept the big 3 races on this day. We're going to talk about the Muniz Memorial here in a little bit, but he was just something else on Friday, or on Saturday. His horses just dominating the big races, and Bonnie South was no different. That 106, it doesn't look all that great compared to the Vision, but in this race she romped. It did look like a decent setup, and she took full advantage. Finite, I'm not really sure what happened with her. I guess I jumped on the bandwagon a little bit too quick, because I know both of us were kind of against her last 2 times, and maybe we should have hung in there one more race, and she just didn't have it. She kind of regressed back to the figure she'd been running, and she had run a 108 last time and only a 102 here, and just never looked like a winner at any point in the race to me.
Yeah, Bonnie South did win that allowance race last time. I believe I called it a maiden race. That was the first time that she was crossing the finish line in first, though, which is what got me confused there. This is the second time she did so in the Fairgrounds Oaks. I thought Bonnie South ran really well. Like you, as you said, the pace might have helped her a little bit, but she really did finish off this race strongly. She's obviously a 3-year-old filly who's improving at the right time. It's kind of funny that she's bred on the exact same cross as Finite, and they look pretty similar in their physical makeup. They're both by Munnings out of Tappet mares, but Bonnie South does come from a really strong Juddmonte female family. Her dam side traces back to some of their best brood mares like Will Star and Viviana. They produced horses like, Sight Seek, and I think even Hidden Scroll is part of this deeper family. So it's definitely a strong family for Juddmonte that Bonnie South comes from. And she can improve from here and do better. Like you said, the 106 TimeformUS speed figure is just okay. So she's going to have to do better to get to those grade 1 races eventually, but she does have room for improvement. As for Finite, I don't have a whole lot to add. I guess we just jumped on the bandwagon, after we should have, because she was such a short price in this race. And she really hadn't run speed figures that made her so formidable against these, except in the Rachel Alexandra last time. So she just regressed to her prior efforts. It turns out the Rachel Alexandra was the outlier in her PPs. And we'll see where they go from here. She's probably going to get a break because she's been running for quite a while. And I think there aren't going to be that many spots to run in for these top horses for a little bit of time. So maybe that's just what she needs. And we'll see these horses come back with some stronger performances in the later spring and maybe the summer.
Yeah, it's a good point about her schedule. She certainly has been busy. We don't usually see a lot of 2-year-olds and newly turned 3-year-olds run as often and as consistently as her. So a break could do her some good.
We'll stick with the dirt races for now. And a little bit before they ran those 2 races for the 3-year-olds, the older horses were in action in the grade 2 New Orleans Stakes for the 4-year-olds and up, going a mile and an eighth. This was a race that I know you had to break out from a pace standpoint, because it was just kind of the outlier on the card, where they went so slow in the early going. And if you just looked at the final time, raw time for the race, it just didn't really stack up with races like the Fairgrounds Oaks and the Louisiana Derby. Because by my standards, while he hasn't proven that he's at the top of this division or quite close to it, he is a pretty good horse, and he had run some pretty big speed figures coming into this race, including in the Louisiana Derby last year.
Yeah, I think he's the one horse out of this race I would think has a promising future, as far as advancing into maybe even grade one competition. Silver Dust, we talked about him on the forecast. Neither one of us were a fan. He just kind of been beaten up on lesser horses, really. And he faced a couple tougher ones in here and wasn't able to get the job done. I guess you have to give Fearless a pass given the trip that he had. It was virtually a no-hope trip given the start and the traffic and getting fouled in the lane, I guess. And I think that's just one you can put a line through. Not sure what was going on with the ride on him, how he was so far back. I know he had trouble at the start, but it still seemed like maybe you could have asked him and got him a little closer and avoided some of that trouble. But overall, just it's hard to get behind any of these horses except maybe Beimer Standards. He got a 118. As you say, that was a breakout just because of pace. If I had just rated this race on final time alone, it would have been in the low 100s, like maybe a 101, a 102, which just makes no sense for any of the horses in here. So I'm pretty comfortable with the rating that I gave the race. It should have some utility going forward. And this has just been a theme at the fairgrounds with these older horses where they haven't been running particularly fast races. It even goes back to last year. I remember the Core Beliefs race in this very same New Orleans Stakes. What was a bit of a head scratcher then, and this one kind of followed that path.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to bring that up as well when Core Beliefs won, because it was a very similar situation where they went slow early and couldn't match the times of the 3-year-olds to run in a later race on the card. I agree with most of what you said about By My Standards. He's a nice horse. I don't think this is the strongest group of older horses that we've been seeing at Oaklawn Park. As for the start of this race, I do think it turned out to be pretty consequential because Silver Dust was kind of hopping up in the gate before they sprung the latch. And I mean, I don't know, I'm not going to criticize the starter, but Silver Dust did look really unsettled even before they pressed the button. So he just caught it at the wrong time. But he broke a little bit slowly, had to rush up then. And the two Brett Calhoun horses really just had it all their way on the right way on the front end. Silver Dust, though, obviously was compromised by having to overcome that slow start. By My Standards, though, he kind of won the break. And I thought Gabriel Saez angled him to the inside pretty hastily and a little bit recklessly, and he caused some traffic for horses inside of him, including Fearless, who I too would have liked to see Florent Roux hustle him a little bit more, but he also was compromised because By My Standards cut over in front of them all so abruptly, and I think it caused a traffic jam down inside. So that also contributed to the pace being so slow, because some horses that would have been more forwardly placed just kind of had to maneuver around a lot of traffic into the first turn. That's usually when the paces of these races are decided. There was a disqualification in this race. Chess Chief was taken down for coming in the lane and compromising Fearless. Was Fearless cost a position? I don't really know. I think Fearless was in trouble for a long time prior to when he got bothered by Chess Chief in the stretch, and he was probably going to finish 6th regardless. So as for the DQ, I kind of went either way on this one. But Fearless, clearly, regardless of whether it was Chess Chief's fault or not, he was compromised by the trip that he got in this race.
Yeah, and I would say as far as the DQ is a bit of a head scratcher when compared to one that we're going to talk about a little bit later. They kind of seem very similar to me because, like you, I don't think Fearless was going anywhere. Hard to say he was cost a position. So just overall, as far as By My Standards goes, I think the jury's still out on him. I certainly have no knocks, but his 2 races this year have both been in races where there hasn't been a whole lot of pace. The other one was not a breakout. I actually rated it on the figures, and he ran that nice 120. So I think we really don't know yet. This is a horse that ran a 119 winning the Louisiana Derby last year. So it's certainly possible a 125, even high 120s is in his future. We just don't know. It's hard to say until he faces a race with a legitimate pace.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add about By My Standards is he got such a perfect trip in this race. And while he was best, he had such an advantage over the horses behind him, including Captivating Moon, who was second, who we should mention. Captivating Moon ran a remarkable race here because he was badly compromised by the pace and was far back early and was running on much faster than the others at the end of this race. So Captivating Moon deserves some extra credit for this performance. But By My Standards, given the trip that he got, I would have liked to have seen him win this race by 5 or 6 lengths, because some horses that were behind him did have trouble, probably didn't come up with their A efforts. If I really thought by my standards was going to go on and be a grade 1 type of horse, I would have wanted to see him really dominate this group. And he had to work a little bit harder in the late stages than I would have liked to have seen. Maybe I'm being way too nitpicky about that. But just given the trip that he got, he really should have been pretty impressive in this race. The biggest speed figure that we saw this weekend was in the race that was right between the New Orleans Stakes and the Fairgrounds Oaks. That was the Grade 2 Mervyn Muniz Memorial, won by Factor This, who I think a lot of people had dismissed, even though he had won just prior to this race, in the race they ran on the Risen Star undercard. That day, he had ridden a bias on the Fairgrounds turf course that really seemed to favor horses on the rail. So some people, including me, got off his bandwagon coming out of that race, because he was the kind of horse that got a perfect trip, that didn't project to get as perfect a trip in this race because there was some other speed signed on, and he figured to have to work harder to get to the front. Well, that didn't really play out, because a couple of horses were compromised at the break, including Secretariat War, who projected to be Factor This's main pace competition. And once again, Factor This got to dominate on the lead through pretty moderate fractions, and they just couldn't catch him.
Yeah, I don't know how moderate. I mean, it's moderate if you just look at the times, but figure-wise, it was solid. It's certainly nothing we haven't read, but it's not like Factor This goes out there and crawls on the front end. He kind of makes you come get him. I think Secretary of War was actually entered as a rabbit in here, maybe for Don't Blame Rocket, and that plan kind of went askew when he just had his head turned. It didn't break very well, but overall, I don't want to knock Factor This too much. He got a big 128 TimeformUS speed figure. He seems like one of the better turf horses out there, and it's just a solid, fast race. I do think there were some trips in behind him that you're probably going to talk about, that particularly the third place finisher, Rock Emperor, had a bit of a tough journey. So I think some horses did run very well in here. The ones that were real head scratchers were Synchrony and Instill Brigard, who just were never really in contention and never looked like they were going to get into contention.
Yeah, and I agree that the pace was it was honest at the very least. I mean, Factor This, he ran the best race and he won by 3 lengths. It was a decisive victory. But Factor This is a horse that, as we saw at his prior start, he does best when he's able to just control on the front end and set his own pace. And his own pace, it can be a legitimate one. He doesn't have to be crawling to be successful. But we saw that he was vulnerable 3 back when that horse Sailing Solo went after him in the early going and kind of cooked him on the lead. And that race ended up setting up for Don't Blame Rocket, who was second here. He was the winner 3 back. But when Factor This gets to set his own pace, he is really difficult to reel in. And while the Fairgrounds turf course didn't have that rail bias like we saw 4 weeks prior, or I should say, I think 5 or 6 weeks prior in the Risen Star, fact, it still was on the firmer side, and I think it did help carry along speed in a few races, and that definitely helped Factor This. And it might have hurt a horse like Rock Emperor, who had to close from farther back, even Synchrony, who just, you saw coming to the quarter pole, there was no way that Synchrony was even going to hit the board because he was just so far back still, and clearly Factor This and Don't Blame Rocket had plenty left on the front end. So I think some riders just misjudged the pace of this race and gave their horses way too much to do. Again, though, not taking anything away from Factor This, who earned the highest TimeformUS speed figure of his career by far, and the kind of number that would make him competitive in Grade 1 stakes races. So we'll see if Brad Cox can get him to hold this form. It was a pretty big day for Brad Cox at the Fairgrounds. I saw a lot of people on Twitter making some jokes about it, and I know after some of those decisions came down from the investigations into Jason Service and Jorge Navarro, people can get a little carried away with their rhetoric about condemning every trainer that has a big day. I do think that's a little bit unfair. I'm not saying that I have any evidence one way or the other about who's doing something and who's not. But I mean, let's be real about Brad Cox's big day on Saturday. I mean, a couple of his winners actually regressed on the speed figure scale, including Wells Bayou, who won the Louisiana Derby. Factor This, though, had been in his barn for a very long time, had been cycling up to a performance like this for quite a while. So I don't think it was a huge surprise that Factor This had this kind of effort in him.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad you brought up Brad Cox. I had mentioned his big day, and me personally, nothing would surprise me anymore. But he's never struck me as much of a guy that I thought was taking any kind of edge. And I just want to say I can't play this game if that's how I think about every race and every trainer. For me, I have to assume things are on the up and up. Let the PP speak for themselves, and if we find out later on down the years and not saying Brad Cox in particular, but trainer A or trainer B are doing something wrong, I just hope they get caught. But as far as a bettor, I just can't look at PPs that way and think that everybody out there's cheating. Somebody has to win these races. He has good stock, good horses, and that's how I'm going to handicap the races until somebody tells me differently.
Yeah, and I want to clarify something because I think people get a little bit confused about this when we say that you can use statistics to figure out who's doing something that doesn't really make sense. And when we say that, we don't mean the statistics on one single race day and just saying, oh, well, this one trainer swept these 3 races on one day means they're doing something nefarious. No, that's way too small of a sample size to be looking at. I mean, we're talking about over a period of months or years. If a trainer is doing something that doesn't make sense, like winning at 40% off the claim with horses that are improving their speed figures by 15 or 20 points, well, that raises some red flags. And I mean, not that I'm saying that I have any information about what Brad Cox is doing, but if you dig into his first off the claim numbers or his trainer switch numbers, they're actually not even that good. So he's not the kind of trainer that you'd put into that category if that's the criteria that you're using. Let's move on to the other turf stakes that they ran a little earlier in the day at Fairgrounds on Saturday. That's the Tom Benson Memorial. And She's on the Warpath, who was an upset winner of the Al Stahl Memorial on that Risen Star undercard. I think a lot of people thought maybe that was a fluky performance when she won at 16-1, but she got the job done once again. Had to work a little harder for the victory here because Altia took a really strong run at her in the very late stages after bulling her way through. But She's on the Warpath was able to just hold on.
She was. It was a fairly good effort for her. She got a 114 TimeformUS speed figure, which matched her performance last time. She's been steadily improving for Steve Margolis, particularly since moving to the turf. I will say she's one that does appear to favor a firm turf course. Her 2 races on yielding courses weren't quite as good. But as soon as she's got back to that firm turf, she's run very well. And, I don't know that she's a graded stakes filly in the future. I guess you have to give her a chance at this point. Altia, I believe you talked about her on the forecast. You didn't particularly like her. I think we know what we have in her. Hard to think she's a graded stakes horse either for Chad Brown. So overall, not the strongest race. I'm sure we'll get to the DQ or non-DQ in this case to talk about that. Just we had a slight difference of opinion, which I think just has more how we view races in general and how the rules should be applied. But not the most exciting race from a speed figure standpoint, but it's plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say about the contenders in this race. She's on the warpath. She found the right situation, I think, in a couple of races at the Fairgrounds this winter. I don't see her as a graded stakes horse moving forward, and I think the speed figures do reflect that, as you were saying. The big disappointment in this race, just to discuss the contenders, was Dream Passage, who we both liked a bit and seemed like she was going to get a pretty easy lead here. Another horse ended up outbreaking her and getting sent to the front, and I think that just took Dream Passage off her game. She was a little bit too keen in the early stages under Florent Giroux. She really is a horse that's more comfortable when she's on the lead. So while her speed figure wasn't that much lower than what she typically runs, she didn't have that pace advantage that I think a lot of people expected her to have. As for the DQ, it's for me, I mean, there are 2 sides to the coin here. One, if you're following the rules as they're usually applied and written, I don't think you can use those rules to disqualify Altia for what Joao Rosario did in this race, because it's hard to argue that the horse that was fouled was definitely cost a position in this race, even though she was forced to angle inside and encountered maybe a little bit more traffic than she otherwise would have if Altia hadn't bowled her way through. So I don't know. I have trouble applying the rules that way. And also, for me personally, I am much more of a category 1 proponent. I don't like these category 2 rules. I don't like seeing horses that have the ability and use their ability to attain higher positions just getting arbitrarily placed 6th or 7th or last just because of their actions of their rider. I don't think that's the right thing to do. I don't think, to put it another way, I don't think those people that bet Altea deserve to be penalized, and I don't think that the people that bet Desert Ride got anything out of this anyway by elevating her from 6th to 5th. So I think that adjudicating the positions that the horse has finished in this situation, it's not helping anybody, and it's certainly not deterring the riders.
Yeah, I can certainly see that point of view. I guess where my frustration comes in is the riders don't really get punished. They get a couple of days, they get a little fine, but what he did was particularly dangerous in my opinion. And I don't think you should be, just because you're on a better horse, when a rider puts himself in a bad position, I don't think he should be allowed to just bull his way out and endanger other horses and riders and basically get rewarded. He's going to get his share of the purse money. So I guess I definitely can see the part about the DQs, but I just wish the stewards would do a little better job and really give these guys the punishment they deserve, because I just think it's a terrible optic to see that people who were tuning in to watch racing for the first time, which there could have been a lot of them on Saturday. It was on Fox. I just think it gives the game a bad look when you see a ride like that and nothing happens.
Yeah, and I agree that the optics are bad. And I know because the optics are bad, we want to be reactionary and see something happen immediately. And sometimes these situations, they do require a little bit more review. They also require the stewards to be more proactive and use more of the tools at their disposal, because I really don't believe that disqualifications are the right way to handle these things, because it ends up creating confusion among the bettors, and it ends up disaffecting a lot of bettors because, like I said, if a DQ had been put into action in this race, I don't think anybody benefits. I think it's actually a net negative for everybody involved. And if you really think that Joel Rosario was a problem in this race, I think a suspension and a fine is the way to go, and probably steeper fines and steeper suspensions than what we're used to seeing. There was a race at Gulfstream Park on, I believe, Sunday this week when Paco Lopez came out badly on the turn of a race and caused a horse to almost clip heels. And there was a disqualification. A horse that I think finished first was disqualified and placed last. I mean, again, it's a very similar situation where you're penalizing the bettors for something that Paco Lopez did that he does all the time. And maybe we should be taking a look at that and saying, okay, do we really want to punish the bettors, or do we want to punish a rider that seems to be doing this week in and week out and really deter him from doing this again by laying down a much steeper suspension than we've ever done before? And I think that's something that the stewards have to reevaluate.
Yeah, and he's the perfect example where if you don't treat this seriously and you just and he's actually had a little bit more than a few slaps on the wrist in his day, but clearly It's not enough to change what he does, because he's just a dangerous rider out there. And that's the frustrating part for me. I'm totally with you on the DQs. It just, sometimes my frustration boils over at these guys just having a free pass to do what they want. And it creates a dangerous situation. And like you, I want to see the stewards do more.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely better ways to handle some of these situations, and it just requires a changing of the culture. And we'll see if that ever occurs. Let's finish up that Saturday card at the fairgrounds with one more race. It was a maiden race that was run a little bit earlier on the card, going the 2-turn mile and 16th distance. Second time starter Mystic Guide for Godolphin and Mike Stidham won this race by 5 lengths in pretty impressive fashion. This guy's got a regal pedigree on him, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him eventually make his way into stakes company.
Yeah, I was curious why you picked this race. I assumed it had to do with pedigree, because speed figure wise, I mean, it was good. It's a 103, but compared to the top 3-year-olds we're seeing, it's nothing to write home about. I mean, we've been talking about low 100 speed figures since back in August when these horses were 2-year-olds. So I assumed it had something to do with pedigree. So I'm going to leave it to you to expound on that.
Yeah, I mean, just from comparing the raw times of this race, he ran 900ths of a second slower than Bonnie South did in the Fairgrounds Oaks. And given that he's a colt and she's a filly, maybe you'd want to see him running a little bit faster at this point if he's really going to ascend into stakes company soon. But this was just this horse's second career start. He debuted going 6 furlongs on the Risen Star undercard, actually. And I thought he closed for third really well that day. But this horse, Mystic Guide, is one that's definitely bred to go longer distances. He's by Ghost Zapper. His dam is Music Note, who was a multiple Grade 1 winner for Godolphin back about a decade ago. She's a horse that ran against Proud Spell in the Alabama. She's a horse that I think has kind of been forgotten a little bit. She was so good back in, I think, 2008, 2009. She's a horse that I think was racing during that synthetic era for the Breeders' Cup. So she's one of those that never really got to show what she could do on the biggest stage because she just wasn't quite as good over synthetic surfaces as she was on the dirt. But I think one of her best performances was when she defeated Indian Blessing and Informed Decision, turning back into Ballerina at Saratoga. She was just a really versatile horse who won multiple Grade 1s at different distances. And Mystic Guide, I really did like the way he finished off this race. Brian Hernandez rode him like he was the best horse, wasn't afraid to take him very wide around the far turn, just riding him like he was much the best. And he really did draw off impressively in the late stages. We'll see if he can run fast from here, because I agree, the 103 TimeformUS speed figure, it's not quite as high as you would have liked to see for a horse that might be stepping up into stakes company eventually. But he's going to have time to continue to mature. And I just thought this one has shown some real potential in his first 2 starts.
Yeah, he certainly finished off the race well. After 6 furlongs, his pace figure was only a 97. Final time figure for this race was a 105. So he certainly proved he can finish in the lane. And, you know, given the who knows where we're going, where these horses are going to show up. But for example, if he were to face a lot of the horses we saw in the Louisiana Derby later on the card, I wouldn't be afraid to take a shot with him in there, just based on potential, because we've seen what those can do over and over. And I wasn't all that impressed. So good pick of this horse. And certainly I remember his dam. She was a runner, Music Note. It's a shame she didn't get a chance in the Breeders' Cup during that synthetic era, but you know, you won't see many bred as good as this one.
Let's finish up the fairgrounds with one race from earlier in the week. It was a Wednesday allowance race on the turf, going 1 mile and a 16th. And Parlor, who's a horse that I know we've talked about a little bit when he was entered in some stakes races, I think both last year and earlier this year, got a little class relief here for Mike Maker. I think this was his 3rd start since being claimed by Mike Maker. Definitely the best performance that he's put forth for this barn, though, because he won this race so easily, showed more tactical speed than he had in some of his recent races. And I don't think Florent Drew ever took the stick out with this horse in the stretch. I mean, he was just under a hand ride all the way to the wire and finished up in pretty fast time.
Yeah, this was his 3rd race for Mike Maker, and what jumped out at me is something you mentioned, is his newfound early speed. This horse has run a lot of fast TimeformUS speed figures in his career, several 120s, but all he has to show for it is a small stakes win at Delaware, a bunch of allowance wins. So he's never really had that breakthrough in stakes competition, but as you look through his PPs, the one thing that jumps out is this is a horse that always comes from pretty far back in the field. Didn't matter if the pace was fast or slow. He just always made that one late run. And now this is 2 races in a row where he showed a little more early speed, and actually a lot more early speed this time. And not only was he much closer up, he really finished off this race like you'd like to see. So he looks like a horse that even as a 7-year-old, Maker has at an absolute peak. And I would expect him to show up in stakes races pretty soon and actually be very competitive.
Yeah, he was actually in for the $80,000 claiming tag in this race, though he was not claimed. So he's still in Mike Maker's barn. And I agree. He's the kind of horse that could easily step right back up into stakes company, because it seems like Maker hasn't going in the right direction right now. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where their big race of the weekend was the gazebo for the 3-year-olds going 6 furlongs. We discussed this race a little bit on the TimeformUS Forecast on Friday. And I know you liked the winner of this race long weekend for Tom Amos. I was a little bit skeptical, but I've got to say his performance in this gazebo made a believer out of me. He just ran them off their feet from the start.
Yeah, it turned out I mentioned he might be the speed of the speed. I mean, 6-5 isn't going to get anybody rich, but he definitely ran very well. as you said, he opened up quick. He was really quick out of the gate. His speed figure or his pace figures were nothing, particularly illuminating, other than he was able to outrun the others. He only had a 1:17 for the quarter mile, yet found himself a length and a half clear at that point. He actually tried to take a little breather. His pace figure dipped down and he got challenged at that point, was only a half length in front. But from there, he just ran away from him. And that 1:14 is certainly a career best for him. And his two races this year have been very good. And he looks like a really promising sprinter. The rest, the gap back to the others, it's hard to get too excited about him. Lycan was actually my top pick in here. He looked like he was making a move turning for home, and he just flattened out, couldn't even catch Little Menace for second. So the only one I really want out of here is Long Weekend, and he does look like there's some promise.
Yeah, I really like this effort. It's not a race where I would downgrade his performance because there was that one blue color coded pace figure. Really, I think that's just a function of the fact that he kicked away at the end so impressively, because it did seem at the top of the stretch like Little Menace was going to give him a real run for his money. That horse had gotten a good trip up to that point, got a split at the top of the lane, and just couldn't really make any ground on Long Weekend. Actually was losing ground in the final eighth of a mile. And I just think it's a testament to how well Long Weekend ran in this race. 1:14 is a solid speed figure for a 3-year-old at this time of the year, and he's going to have to run a little bit faster to step up to some of the bigger graded stakes races later on. But this is only his 4th career start. He definitely has shown talent right from the beginning. So this is a horse that I think we could be hearing from in some bigger races down the line. Another race at Oaklawn Park from this past weekend was a Friday allowance race where Mia Mischief, the former Grade 1 winner, was in action. I think this was her first start of 2020. She had disappointed a little bit towards the end of 2019, ended up not making it to the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint that past year, because she had disappointed in a couple of the prep races. But she got back on track here on the right foot with this allowance victory. It's been a little while since Mia Mischief has run one of her top speed figures, but she didn't have to produce that to beat this field.
She didn't, and not only that, this was a race where the pace was slow. We have it coded in blue, and reasonably so. It's one, if it was just Mia Mischief in the race, it's one I might even consider doing a breakout. But when you look at the rest of the field, it was particularly weak, and doing so would have gave those horses figures that they probably aren't capable of reproducing. So I wound up settling on a 1:09 for her. It was a 1:12 final time, which is nothing too eye-opening, but again, it was just probably what she needed to get that confidence back. She really didn't have any competition in here. Her main threat seemed to be Hotshot Anna, a horse who has done most of her good running on the turf and particularly on synthetic surfaces. I think she's won that Presque Downs Masters a couple times. So she didn't really take the dirt. So once that happened, it was Mia Mischief basically in a race by herself. So more like a paid workout than an actual race for her.
Yeah, and we'll see if she can eventually bounce back to some of those big efforts that we saw from her last year. Obviously, she posted that gigantic speed figure in the Humana Distaff when she got that Grade 1 victory back in 2019. Ever since that duel with Kofefi and that Roxolana Stakes back last June, she hasn't quite gotten back to that, high 1-teens or 120 TimeformUS speed figure range. Seems like that race might have knocked her out a little bit. So we'll see if this performance in this allowance race can get her back on the right track.
The one thing that would concern me with her is she seems to have lost some of her early speed. I forget off the top of my head. I think she's a 5-year-old mare. But, that's never a great sign, even in a field this week. Maybe it was by design. Maybe they're trying to teach her a new dimension. But she's normally not as far back as she is. And seeing it against a weaker field was a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we noticed that as the year wore on back in 2019. I know she was surprisingly off the pace in that honorable miss when she lost at Saratoga at a short price. And I think that trend has carried through a little bit. And I was surprised as well to see her as far back as she was early in this race. She overcame it against this kind of field. We'll see if she can do the same against a tougher field. At Santa Anita on Saturday, they ran a couple of Grade 3 events on the turf at very different distances. The first was a sprint race at the shortest distance they run on the turf. That was the 5.5 furlong San Simeon. And this race featured a pretty good battle to the wire as Bound for Nowhere, who shipped in from Kentucky for Wesley Ward, made one of his rare appearances in the afternoon at the racetrack. He was bet down to 2-5 here and really did look like a winner at the 8th pole, but Sistron was just relentless and came and ran him down on the wire.
He did, and Bound for Nowhere actually got a slightly higher speed figure on our scale of 121 compared to Sistron's 120, which is just splitting hairs. I never would make a bet based on a 1-point differential. The thing I would say is I think Bound for Nowhere actually, even though he lost late by just a head, I think he lost the race at the start. He just didn't come out of the gate well. He had to be rushed up. He wound up having to battle for the lead and fight for just to get it at the top of the lane. So off the bench, I thought it was a good effort from him, but Sistron did something he hadn't really done before, and that was win off of a long layoff, and he looked really good doing it. He's a proven sprinter now on dirt and on turf. I think he was at least a grade 2 winner. I can't remember if he won a grade 1 or not, but he's done it running some big speed figures. He had a 125 last year on the dirt. So just a really talented sprinter who, in a division that hasn't proven particularly strong, especially out west, he probably vaults right back to the top of that division.
Yeah, I thought this was one of the strongest races that we've seen out there for the turf sprinters. And I agree, Bound for Nowhere, he was compromised at the break. I didn't get a chance to watch the head-on, but just looking at the pan, it did seem like the rail runner Sparkyville maybe just broke out a little bit, and that compromised Bound for Nowhere, who got bumped around a bit at the start. And for a speed horse like him, you never want to have trouble at the start of these 5.5 furlong races, because the start is so important in getting that early position, especially for a horse with his running style. So he ran really well. We'll see where he goes from here. He seems like the kind of horse that's just always coming off a layoff. He rarely puts starts back to back for whatever reason. It seems like Wesley Ward just gives him a lot of time on the bench. It does seem to pay off for him because he comes off the bench really well. But Sistron, I mean, as you said, he came off the layoff here with one of his top efforts. Seemed like maybe he had shown the dirt was his preferred surface last year because he started winning on that surface, but he continued his winning ways on the turf here. It just seems like he's a horse that's really found himself now in his older age. And I think whether they go back to dirt or continue on the turf, he's going to be really dangerous in any of these top level stakes races out in California.
Yeah, just last night I did look it up. He's just a grade 2 winner. He didn't get a grade 1, but given the form he came back in, it wouldn't surprise me if he got one out there in California.
Yeah, I agree with that because he's posted some pretty big speed figures in the past. Later in the card at Santa Anita on Saturday, they ran the 1.5 mile San Luis Rey, another grade 3 event. And this one was won by Ward and Jerry, who I think really just won this race due to a perfect trip. I mean, stalking the pace. And his main rival, Oscar Dominguez, while he didn't have a ton of trouble, he didn't ever get to wind up that big late run like he likes to make, caught a little traffic at the quarter pole, was just never really in the hunt to be competitive for the victory here. And once you took Oscar Dominguez out of the mix, it's not like Ward and Jerry had that much to beat in this field.
No, I think I mentioned on the forecast, I thought this was a 2-horse race, and it kind of played out just like I said for one of those rare times I got something right, where he just had a tactical edge. He was a bit closer to the pace. He avoided traffic. Everybody else kind of stopped running, and he just inherited the lead and kept going. He got back to a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, which is generally what he runs when he gets into these extended turf routes. And you know, it's just a weak group out there right now, and that's about what it takes to win these races. So, as I said, a jump from a Calbred stake to a grade 3 in Southern California isn't really much of a jump at all. And I mean, you only got 9-5 for the effort, so it's not like he was a big surprise in here. And Oscar Dominguez, he is what he is at this point. He's not going to win a whole lot of races. He's always going to come running late. But unfortunately for those who like him, he always seems to take a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, you could tell that Ward and Jerry was in the much better position coming around the far turn, and it's no surprise that he was able to win the race from there. He probably looked odds on from the half-mile pole because Oscar Dominguez did have to steady a little bit at the quarter pole and alter course, and just not the kind of trip you want to see for a closer. He probably wasn't winning this race anyway, though. But, it's a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. These aren't the top level turf horses out there. It's been a pretty weak group in this division out in California. So I don't have a whole lot of optimism about these horses achieving much success in these higher level races in the future. Final race we're going to talk about on the podcast this week is an allowance race from Gulfstream Park on Saturday. It was the 7th race there, going a mile on the turf. And the winner of this race, Golden Tappet, now 2 for 2 on the turf. Since returning from a layoff, he's now undefeated this year in 2020. And just watching the replay of this race, I didn't catch it live, was really impressed by this horse. He's one that I know we had highlighted after his maiden victory because he had won that race in very fast time for a maiden special weight event. He repeated that speed figure here, but I was even more impressed by this race because he was beating a better field, and he did it without a perfect trip.
He did. This was a good effort. He matched the 113 TimeformUS speed figure he had done. He had earned breaking his maiden. And again, just another really strong effort. One thing to keep in mind with these turf speed figures is it's really tough to say, how much faster he could have ran, because especially on turf, they're not racing against the clock. They're racing to get to the wire first. As you said, he had a tough trip. He was off a bit slow, and he just looks like a stakes horse to me. What I thought was particularly interesting was he cut back a furlong in distance, where after watching him break his maiden at 1 1/8, he looked like a horse who could go even further. Maybe this was just the right spot and they wanted to get him a race in. But, I'm curious what you think about his distance potential, because 1 mile doesn't even seem ideal to me. And he handled it like a champ.
No, I have the same thought. I mean, last time he seemed like a horse that would keep going 1.25 miles or perhaps even farther when he won that 1 1/8 race at Gulfstream. So I was a little bit worried about him cutting back to the mile distance, and especially after he blew the start of this race. He broke about a length behind the field. Quickly, though, I thought Luis Saez did a good job of getting him to the inside and getting him into a good mid-pack position. From there, though, I mean, he lost so much ground coming around the far turn, angling 5 wide for much of the run around the far turn into the stretch, but he carried so much momentum into the lane and just opened up really impressively at the end. It's not like Luis Saez was even all over him. He was just basically hand riding him to the wire. And this horse just has such a beautiful, big, loping stride on him. Seems like one that shouldn't have more trouble with added ground, just based on the way that he moves and the way he finishes off these races. And his pedigree would lead you to believe the same thing, because, I mean, he's got as great of a pedigree as you can imagine. He's a full brother to Untappable, that multiple grade one winning Kentucky Oaks and Breeders' Cup Distaff winner. He's also a half brother to Patio Prado. So there's really the pedigree for him to be a top turf horse. And I'm just excited to see where Brendan Walsh can take this runner, because he's a 4-year-old. He's very lightly raced. I imagine stakes races are going to be on the horizon pretty immediately after this, because he's proven that he's good enough to step up there. He's going to have to run a little bit faster, but a lot of times these turf horses just run to their competition, and they can improve when they move up to stakes company if they are those kinds of horses. And I get the sense he is that kind of horse.
Yeah, I have the same feeling as well. We kind of echoed the same thoughts on the speed figure. Just because he only ran a 113 these last 2 times, and I say only loosely because we're talking about him moving in the stakes, he easily looks like a horse to me who could run quicker figures. So he's a promising one for sure. Unfortunately, as we said, we got some, times we just don't really know what's going to happen and where he's going to be able to race. But Brendan Walsh seems to be taking his time with him, as he showed by entering him in an allowance here. And I really do think he's one, as you do, that is promising and then can move in the stakes company.
Those are all the races we're going to talk about on this week's podcast. I think we're both hopeful that we'll have more to talk about when we do the TimeformUS forecast on Friday this week. 3 days seems like an eternity lately in this current climate that we're in. But hopefully there's some racing for us to discuss on Friday. I know scheduled is that big race day at Gulfstream Park, where they're going to run the Florida Derby, as well as a whole slew of undercard stakes races. So I hope that we've got that to discuss, because it would be a nice diversion to handicap a card like that for the weekend. But we'll see how things play out, and we'll monitor everything, and we'll keep you abreast of all those developments if there are any changes for Friday. But as of now, plan to listen to us then too. You can always listen to us and all of the archives of these podcasts on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, guys, and I hope that we'll be back with you on Friday.